Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you're staying cool somehow, despite all of this. But the Wild Goose is, as you know, such a wonderful event, and I hope you're having a great time here. We're going to talk about something called How to Heal Our Divides. And How to Heal Our Divides is a series of 2 books. I'll try to show them to you. You can pick them up in the bookstore or see me afterwards or what have you, but they are both compilations from multiple authors. The outgrowth of me reading a bunch of books during the pandemic and being frustrated about reading lots of good books about racism and political and religious issues, et cetera, but very little was written about, okay, what do we do about it? So it was very frustrating to me. So I talked to my friend Brian McLaren and several other folks to just say, hey, what do you think about trying to pull something together? You know, do you have some ideas of people we could include or organizations we can include that are actually doing things about, solving all these serious divides that we have? And so sure enough, like within a few weeks, we were like oversubscribed in terms of the number of people that had agreed to contribute chapters to these books. So today we're going to just talk about the issues a little bit, or the books a little bit. With us is, in addition to Brian McLaren, Tambry Harris, Survivors and Thrivers, and Alexia Salvatierra. And these folks and many others were gracious enough to contribute to this. Also joining us, I think, later will be Therese Taylor Stinson. I know she was here earlier, but I think she got delayed, so hopefully she'll be here before we get finished. So, in any event, to start off, I'd love for folks just to share a little bit about what you wrote in the book, for those that are not familiar with them. Alexia, do you want to start first? Is that okay?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. So, I've done a lot of bridge building in my life, but what I wrote about in the book was around immigration. Now, immigration is an issue that it's very hard to talk about rationally. For some of us, it provokes the kind of biological response that a dog has when there's food and another dog approaches. For some of us, it's about our families. And if you hurt my kid, I'm not irrational. So, what do you do when you're in disagreement over something that you can't talk about rationally? You have to go underneath and over. So we got pastors together, immigrant and non-immigrant pastors, in a prayer meeting to talk about pastoral concerns, not immigration policy, pastoral concerns. And then we did this with white pastors and Hispanic pastors, immigrant pastors, and then with Hispanic immigrant pastors and black pastors. So 2 separate meetings. As the Hispanic immigrant pastors started talking about what was happening to families in their congregation and to young people as a pastoral concern, the English-speaking pastors began to feel things differently, because they were identifying with the immigrant pastors. Then we had a very deep, very honest, very hard conversation, because you really have to talk about all the issues. But until you have that heart connection, it's not a productive conversation. But once we had that heart connection, we were able to have deeper conversation. And then we said, but then how do we take this back to our congregations? And we decided that when you were dealing with communities, that you had to go beyond just common ground, that you actually had to have an experience of joint ministry. So common ground, that was action and not only talk. So we got immigrant and non-immigrant leaders to go together to visit children in detention centers and to do prison ministry, to do vacation Bible school, and soccer, and baking. And then it wasn't just hearing the stories of the kids. It was talking to your partner, because now you had established trust by being in ministry together, It was talking to your partner about their lives. And those conversations being conversations between people who then trusted each other. And then the last step that happened was we had this whole careful plan for how we would then go back with the experiences of those volunteers to the congregations. And of course, the volunteers didn't wait for our plan, which meant a lot of interesting blow-ups, but in the end it meant creating a coalition between, and these are mostly evangelical congregations, white evangelical congregations and Hispanic evangelical congregations in Orange County called Loving the Stranger, which ultimately led to the creation, one of the major forces behind the creation of the Evangelical Immigration Table, which at one point was the broadest coalition of evangelicals working together on a social justice issue since abolition. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Alexia. Tambry, why don't you tell folks about your organization and what you do and what you wrote about?
Absolutely. So the foundation of my chapter is that silence and shame divide us. They divide us internally, and they divide us across each other. And the specific silence and shame that I'm talking about is from sexual abuse and domestic violence. And many of us in this space will tell you that, we can be at a cocktail party and shut it down immediately when we're asked, what do you do? Because no one wants to talk about it. And so I decided when, it was about 5 years ago, when all the hashtag #MeToo hands started going up, I wondered, okay, these individuals are having the courage to come forward and say, yes, it happened to me, which is huge because we feel so isolated. And yet the hands go back down, they go back in their silos, and they stay in that shame and that silence. And so I started, I'm both a childhood sexual abuse survivor and a domestic violence survivor. And the connection between those two is that because of what happened to me as a child led to the limiting beliefs in me that made me believe I was not worthy. And so I didn't deserve to be treated well. And so I married unhealthy, abusive people. So part of my mission and my organization, Survivors to Thrivers, is to help every survivor know that they are worthy, to be able to identify those limiting beliefs. And that's where that divide is within us, right? Our brains are telling us these things. They keep us stuck in this unhealthy place. So first of all, helping individuals begin to do that healing work, recognize those messages that they're telling themselves that are holding them in bondage. And then also encouraging others to be supporters and bridge the silence and the secrecy that their loved ones might be feeling to encourage that healing. So my chapter talks about this. It talks about the resources the organization provides, and it really encourages survivors to know that there is a community there for them. And it also really encourages those, and it's everybody else, truly, because every one of us has survivors in our life. You may not even know it, but being able to be an ally and a supporter.
Great. Thank you, Tambry. Go ahead, Ryan.
So I just wrote the introduction to one of the books. But I suppose the main role I played in the book is that when Brian had this idea, I was able to tell him a lot of people who are doing beautiful things like you just heard about to approach to be part of this project. I think we all are aware that there are a lot of people who are working very hard to intensify divisions. They have reasons for doing that. And to accelerate and intensify fear and hostility and misunderstanding and so on. And then there are people who are doing the good work of trying to study the causes of that and understand the dynamics of that. That's important. And then there are other people who are saying, what are the creative things we can do in response to this perpetual human problem, that there are reasons why it's been intensifying lately. And so finding those people and lifting up their work seemed like a very worthwhile thing. Some of you know I have the privilege of working with Father Richard Rohr, and one of Richard's famous sayings is the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. And so finding people who are practicing better things in many different ways, because our problems are complicated enough that there's no one solution. And in fact, one of the problems we often have is people are doing good things and the problem isn't solved. So we say, that's not working, which is terribly discouraging to the people who are doing those good things. The world would be a much worse place if they weren't doing those good things. What I think we need to say is, they're doing good things, but more and different things need to be done. And what are those things? So that was part of the impetus, and I think Allain's wisdom in saying, let's get a lot of voices together for this.
So there is a lot of diversity in this book, both from a authorship perspective as well as the different types of divides that we're dealing with. You've heard about abuse and you've heard about immigration. There's also chapters on racial reconciliation, the LGBT divide, abilities. I try to make it across a broad spectrum of different issues, knowing that in any single chapter you're not going to be able to go into any amount of depth. This was not intended to be a deep, dive into any of these different issues. It was an attempt to just build awareness, as Brian said, of all these different organizations that a lot of folks just haven't heard of. And they're doing wonderful work. And I just felt like, okay, we need to, just try to expand that and help them expand their charters. So that was what kind of was behind it. And it came together incredibly quickly. I think, as I said, within a few weeks, we were oversubscribed on the first book in terms of the number of people that had said yes to do this. And because we self-published it, the book was available less than 5 months after that. So, time to market was really important to me, and that's why I chose that path. And it just shows when you kind of hit a nerve that a lot of people will say yes to it, to fulfilling a need that has been there. So, in any event, it's been about 2 years now since the first book came out. And so I'd like to hear your all thoughts on, are things better or are things worse? Either at the macro level or at the specific area that you're involved in. You can approach it either way. But are things better or worse than they were 2 years ago? Tambry, you want to start?
I'll be happy to. At a macro level, I often, I'll look out and see, reading the newspaper, seeing the news can be very disheartening. So you could think, it's worse. But I think a little bit what Brian was saying, where there are so many different things happening, and the more we can raise awareness around the efforts and giving people opportunity to plug in, to give voice, to bring hope, that does encourage me. I will say on my topic, it can be very disheartening for me, to be honest, because, it's one of those things, we'll hold a conference and people will sit in their cars outside the building because they don't want to go in because there's so much triggering in them, and or they know, if somebody sees me walking into the building, they know, that I've been affected in some way. And so again, thus my passion to make this something that we truly can not be stigmatized and truly bring hope. So I think it's getting better. We are actually having gatherings, but it's still an uphill battle right now.
Brian?
I think we all know that there are ways that things are getting better, and there are ways that things are getting worse.
Yep.
And maybe what I could say is sometimes when things look like they're getting worse, that's necessary for them to get better.
Amen.
That's not always true, but in some ways, Bruce Race Chow, a brilliant Presbyterian leader and author, says that pointing out the division is not being divisive. In other words, being able to talk about things and bring it to the surface, in some ways, people say you're being divisive by pointing out a division. But in order to heal the division, you have to point it out. And so I just think that's why it's a complicated, important question with a complicated answer. I'd love to hear what Alexia thinks.
So the only things being publicized by and large are the things that are getting worse.
Yes.
So I don't think anybody knows.
Yes.
I do want to say that in the arena I work in, on a federal policy level, things are worse. Even though the Biden administration is quite a bit better than the Trump administration, but overall, for lots of reasons, things are worse. I do want to say, though, that I think that a lot of little seeds that started to be planted during the Trump administration because of the level of deep shock and outrage people felt, the level of concern people felt about the growing division that was more and more obvious, that there's work that started then that keeps getting more and more creative and more sophisticated on every level of our society. You know, there's a group in Congress called the Problem Solvers. Do you see any press about them? Never. But they're there, and they're there because everybody got so upset about the divide. So, you know, I think I have experienced in my lifetime that people in movements get more and more sophisticated, and so do the opponents. So nobody can measure this, but, you know, I think Jesus was really big on saying to us, don't measure things. It's not healthy.
Very good, very good. Well, clearly there are plenty of things that are not going so well, right, that are getting worse. But at least as I watch the organizations that were included in these two books, and I watch the plethora of additional new organizations that are doing good things, I have to feel good. I have to feel positive. And maybe the driving force has been that things got so bad, right? And I just as Alexia is saying, I'm sure that that's a contributor to this. But I also, maybe call me an optimist, but I mean, I do feel that things are getting better. At least, again, when I pay attention to the organizations that are highlighted in the book that are growing so much and really impacting more folks, as well as the new organizations that have sprung up since then. So there's hope. All right, next, I'd love for the members, I mean, Alexia already kind of did this, but within that book, you know, there were less than 60, I think, organizations that we were able to highlight, which means there's a whole bunch out there that are doing good work that, you know, are not included in that book. And as Alexia said, a lot of them we haven't heard of. So let's hear about some of them. I'd love for each of you to, you know, talk about some organization or more than one, if you'd like, that you feel is doing a really wonderful job at healing some type of serious social divide. Brian, you want to start that one?
Yeah, there's so many, but an organization I've been honored to be a supporter of and volunteer with is called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of them, but if you live east of the Mississippi River and you eat a tomato in the wintertime, they touched your food. Because most of the tomatoes are grown in southern Florida where I live, and they're picked by farm workers who a minority have, you know, legal documentation. Our current governor is, I mean, it'll be so fascinating to see what happens with this because he's now making their lives even more difficult. Which means that now the rich owners of grocery stores and you know, the people in different parts of the food chain don't have workers to pick their crops. But watching what the coalition has done over the last 30 plus years is really beautiful because it was a situation where business and the state both profited by leaving people vulnerable, but by leaving farm workers vulnerable. Just to give you two quick examples. Until a couple of years ago, farm workers in Florida who pick tomatoes, and there's people who cut sugar cane and people who pick citrus, and very often the people who start picking tomatoes in the winter in Florida end up picking apples in Michigan in October. So it's a similar group of people who every year make this sort of move. But they got paid the same amount for picking a 30-pound bucket of tomatoes for over 30 years. They worked for 30 years without a raise.
Wow.
And there was nobody who could do anything about it. And so, and everybody profited by leaving them vulnerable. And this group formed, and a Presbyterian minister was one of the people who was a catalyst for this. But one of the brilliant things they did is they said, let's not make this a charity where people who aren't farm workers do something for farm workers. Let's empower the farm workers themselves. And so they helped them form a coalition to work together, and they built relationships between the farm workers and churches and synagogues and civic groups, and then they actually went straight to business. They started with Taco Bell and said, you're making, your whole business is at least pretending to have something to do with Mexicans and Mexican food. And a lot of the people who are working here are Mexican. How about you guys agree to pay the farm workers 1 penny more per pound to pick tomatoes? And it took a lot of pressure and a lot of time and marches and speeches and letter writing campaigns. And Taco Bell said, not because they were particularly generous, but because the right kind of pressure was put on them, they said, we'll do it. So then they said, let's work on McDonald's. And it took a lot of pressure. McDonald's said, okay, we'll do it. And then we were surprised. Walmart said they would do it. And so we got to a majority of the major buyers of tomatoes who agreed to pay a penny more per pound. If any of you live in a state where the grocery store Publix exists, Publix has said no. And they have been absolutely hard-hearted through the whole process. And I've been involved in all kinds of things with putting pressure on Publix. But this has been this fascinating movement to find a way around inactive government to work with farm workers. The last thing I'll say that was a beautiful example of where a creative thing that had really never been done like this before happened among the farm workers. It turns out there are a lot of immigrants in the Northeast who work in mills and factories and chicken and around the country who work in chicken processing plants. And they were in the same situation as the workers in Florida. And so a new term has been developed. It's called worker-driven social responsibility. And so workers from factories and different industries have started coming down to Immokalee to learn from the farm workers, how can we organize workers to work for our own benefit? And most recently, you may have read, this sort of thing happens every year or two in Bangladesh or India or Sri Lanka or Myanmar and many other countries where there's some factory that too many people are crowded into working in unsafe conditions, and then there's an earthquake and the roof comes in, or there's a fire and a bunch of people are killed. And so now organizations in other countries are learning about worker-driven social responsibility. So it just is, it's an example of a long, slow battle. You could say it like this. The coalition felt like they were losing for a very, very long time, and they didn't quit. And then by their persistence, new things developed. I'll say one other thing. A lot of the farm workers who I've gotten to know have maybe a second-grade education, or many of them have never been to any kind of public schooling in their lives because they were poor when they lived in Guatemala or southern Mexico or wherever. And what is it? Well, nobody leaves their country and sets out to try to survive somewhere else unless things are really bad in their country. So these folks have been through hardship. And I've been so impressed with their character. I've been so impressed with their brilliance without formal training. And I remember I said to this one fellow, Edgar, I said, in my bad Spanish, I said to him, how do you keep working when it's so difficult? We had just participated in an action with Publix, and Publix had refused to even talk to us. And Edgar grew up Catholic in southern Mexico when the base community movement that Alexia has just written about and the liberation theology movement was strong in the Catholic Church where he grew up. And he said to me, when I was a child in church, I learned that God is on the side of the poor. Publix is bigger, but God is bigger still. Publix is big, but God is still bigger still. And I thought, this is the purest faith I think I've ever seen. So,
Wow, that is such a great story. Thank you, Brian. Alexia?
Sure, I was thinking about how easy it is when we're frustrated with people calling themselves Christians to just say faith is divisive. Right? We don't want to, we need to move away from faith so that we can find unity. But there are so many groups, but for some reason what kept coming up to me is the group of bereaved parents in the Middle East. How many of you have heard about them? Anybody here? They are Palestinians and Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs who have lost children to the violence in the Middle East. And they are, by and large, people of deep faith. There are Orthodox Jews and deeply committed Muslims, and that's part of what makes them come together around their common grief, because they do believe that there's hope. And my siblings, the only way I think that many of us can hold on to hope in this world is to see something bigger than this world. And that group is certainly all about that. And they haven't won anything yet. Yes. But they are a testimony to faith, and they're a testimony to love, because they have come to love each other as parents who are equally bereaved. The only other honorable mention that I'd like to give is that Christians for Social Action, I have heard that they do very, very good work around LGBTQIA, bringing people together across a very broad spectrum. And they do that because they're learners. They've read the books, they've talked to lots of people, and they don't just have the same model they keep using, they keep changing it up. And so I just want to name that.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. Tambry, go ahead.
So for me, I would say the work is being done more to grassroots level. And I think part of that is because 40% of women have been sexually abused. About 25% men. So there's a whole lot of folks out there who have been hurt and have been wounded. And so the first step is to do that internal bridging that I was talking about, and a lot of people are not able to do that. But a lot of us find our power and our freedom by trying to make a difference and bridge in other ways. And so groups that I think about, one is, I'll do a shout out for an organization here named Dahlia Grove. And they are focused on helping women who have been human trafficked. And so we're finally kind of no longer holding them in shame, saying, how could you have been been sex trafficked? No. And I will tell you, the majority of them experienced sexual abuse as a child, and it put them down a really hard path. And so moving out of our judgment culturally and trying to bring hope and healing is huge. And so Dahlia Grove is here representing, now they're a local organization, I would encourage you all to know those organizations where you've come from, but they're one that comes to mind. Another one that comes to mind is Brave Works. And what they do is they actually help women who are getting out, trying to escape really harsh situations. Sometimes it's human trafficking, sometimes it's domestic violence. And they actually make jewelry and clothing, and they sell it on their website and in stores to be able to bring money in to fund. And it also teaches these women to be able to have skills that they can then take forward. And both of these organizations provide programs as well to try and help give them, because a lot of times they don't have even life skills. And so to teach them life skills to be able to not just get out of the situation, but to then really begin to find a path forward. One of the things I talk about a lot is that going forward chapter. We've had our past chapters, we may be in a current chapter, but what's the going forward chapter? They give them possibilities for their going forward chapters. Another organization that is international is called Stop the Silence. And this one is focused on childhood sexual abuse, and the founder she's the one that I was joking with about how we can, close down a cocktail party, and she's been doing this work for, 35 years. But she is really trying to, again, normalize this conversation. And we actually recently produced a collaborative book, and it's, again, international, which is just really exciting to think that we are coming together across, Egypt, Zambia, New Zealand, Netherlands, U.S., indigenous voices. All these different people are coming together, first of all saying, healing is possible, and giving their stories to encourage others and have the folks not feel so alone where they are. And then we also share our healing practices, and we all have different healing practices. Mine was the embodied path to truth, because my body was the thing that spoke to me loudly and my brain was going to keep me stuck. And finally my body was like, no, you can't stay here anymore. So anyway, I was really excited when that book, it ended up being a bestseller in several categories on Amazon, and I thought, we're not silent anymore. Everybody that has this book in their hands, we're making a difference in their lives, and hopefully they will share. So those are some of the things that come to my mind, Brian.
Isn't it so great to hear all of this good news? It's like on the nightly news on TV, we don't hear all this stuff, right? Which is terrible. And so, please do whatever you can do to spread the word about good things that you hear about. Let me know, let all of us know, let as many of your friends and family know that there are a lot of great people doing some great things out there. And we need to spread the word every chance we can. So the folks up here are really talented people who write lots of books and are involved in lots of different things. So I want to give each of them a chance to kind of say what they're up to these days, what kind of new things are coming down the pike for them. So Alexia, do you want to start off with that, please?
Sure. So for the last 2 years, I'm the academic dean of the Central Latino at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is something I never imagined doing in my whole life. And I am the associate professor of mission and global transformation. So if you're interested in checking out seminary, you could certainly talk to me about that. But that's, for the vast majority of people, part of what we're doing at Central that I'm very excited about is that we have what we call diplomados, which are 6-month online certificate programs. And we have 2 on immigration, one for inside Latin America and one for in the U.S. The one in the U.S. we have in Spanish or English. And they are really in-depth programs on how you, from whatever your situation is, you don't have to be clergy. You don't have to be, have some formal role, but it teaches you how you can make a positive difference in the issue, and you can do it in your living room. So if anybody's interested in those kinds of programs, we have a number of them that are very exciting to me. Because we really all need tools, right? You come here and hear a workshop and you get really inspired, but if you don't have tools, then it's hard to know what to do. So I'm really excited that at Central we now have 5 different diplomado programs. So.
Very cool, very cool. Tambry, how about you?
So I mentioned my organization. It's Survivors to Thrivers. And there's a few different components to it. One of them is to try and really give hope and encouragement to anyone who has suffered trauma or abuse. And I've been told that, the things I share really span a variety of, your trauma and abuse may have come from another source. Y'all are maybe familiar with childhood, I just forgot what it's called. Anyway, there's a lot of different forms of trauma. And so we seek to support really giving daily encouragement through our social media, Instagram and Facebook. Instagram at Survivors to Thrivers, and Facebook at Survivors to Thrivers Official. And we put quotes out. We share stories. I did a shout out about this event, just saying, just really excited that we can get the word out and really encourage others. We also do blogs twice a month where we have stories to be encouraging, but then we also have, again, healing practices for people to use, and it may be physical practices, it may be reflections, different ways for people to do their healing. I also speak at different events. I really enjoy when I'm able to speak at a university because I think about how many people who may be hurting, and also individuals who could be really good supporters for those around them. And so universities are an area that I really have a big heart for, but I obviously enjoy speaking wherever I have an opportunity. I also do transformational coaching. And so with that, it's really helping people look at those deeper wounds that are keeping them stuck. I mentioned my sense of unworthiness and how that kept me in these unhealthy patterns. And so I work with individuals to really look at those unhealthy patterns and how are they keeping them from moving into that next chapter, moving into that whole full life living. And then I also have a book that I wrote that's called Awakening the Light, and that's actually a workbook that does some of the work I do in my coaching practice. But if people need to start stepping into their healing work, kind of in the safety of their own home, that's a great way to do it because I share my story so you feel a kindred spirit, but I also offer some reflective practices. So just trying to continue to support individuals in this space.
Awesome.
Oh, I'm a professor. I also write books, but I always forget that I do that. So, but I do have a couple. I do have a new book.
Good.
A couple new books, actually.
Would you
What are they?
something
Tell us
about it?
more.
So one of them, which I'm actually going to be doing a workshop on, I'm really excited about, called Buried Seeds, Learning from the Vibrant Resilience of Marginalized Christian Communities. And a friend of mine, Brandon Rencher, wrote about the Hush Harbors, which were the independent slave churches, and I wrote about the base Christian community movements in Latin America and the Philippines. But we looked at what was in common between those movements for creating vibrant Christian community that changes the world around us. So I'm going to be doing a workshop on that at 5. And then there's a new book coming out that I was part of called God's Resistance, which is all about sanctuary movements. So anyhow, yeah.
Very cool. So Brian, you're always really busy with all kinds of different things, but what's the latest?
Well, I write. Some of you may know I'm involved with the Center for Action and Contemplation, where one of the things we're involved with right now is after 10 years with a program they created called the Living School, we're trying to look back and learn from those first 10 years and then kind of start over again and diversify and develop that program to kind of its next generation. And one of the things on our mind with this is we've had only a 2-year, very intense kind of graduate school level program. So we're going to restart that in a couple of years, but next year we're restarting a 1-year program. It's a online program, but it's very exciting to watch a curriculum really take shape around engaged contemplation. Contemplation that always is linked to action, and action that always returns us to deepening our learning and thinking and reflecting and growth. But I'll mention something. Tomorrow morning at 10, I'll be co-leading a session with Jim Burklow. Is Jim in the room here? I don't think he is.
I think I saw him earlier.
But there's a new organization just getting started called Zoe, which is an attempt to create a coalition of progressive Christian campus ministries on colleges and universities around the country. So if you're interested in that, it's tomorrow morning.
And, oh, by the way, a new book.
So I have a children's book coming out in October called Corey and the Seventh Story. I'm doing something about that tomorrow afternoon too, just about these 7 stories. That the idea is to help children develop story literacy and tell about story and understand stories that lead to harm and violence, as opposed to stories that lead to healing and peace. And then I have a book coming out next May about climate change and related issues that will be called Life After Doom. So that's, yeah.
So for me, I'm kind of addicted to starting new things. Over the past several years, I worked with Frederick Buechner's family to launch the Frederick Buechner Center and bring him online. I launched something called Writing for Your Life, which has been resources and conferences for spiritual writers. I launched another conference series called Publishing in Color that was specifically meant to increase the number of books that get published by writers of color within the spiritual community. I launched something called Compassionate Christianity. I launched How to Heal Our Divides, obviously that we're here. And I've recently sold 3 of those to other people, which is great because it gives me a chance to launch new things. And so one of the things that Brian and I have been working on together that hasn't been announced yet, it won't be until this fall, but it's called Raising Kids for Good. And it is building together a bunch of resources, recommendations on books and articles and other kinds of resources for parents and for churches in the progressive Christian space. So stay tuned for that this fall. The other thing that I'm kind of in the early stages of launching is called Find Your Next Calling. So if you just go to findyournextcalling.com, you can learn more about that. It's basically part discernment of how to identify like a second calling in life. The second part of it is how to launch your own business. So basically what I'm doing is taking all the stuff that I've learned over the past 8 years or so of launching all these businesses and trying to help other people do the same thing. So that's the new thing for me that's coming up. I think we still have some time, 5 more minutes. So questions? Who has any questions they'd like to ask?
I know y'all are involved in trying to heal divides where you are, so.
Yeah, what are some things
might
you all
have
are
a
doing?
question about
Go
it.
ahead.
I wonder if you think that the slogan "defund the police," I can use the mic, sure.
The dominant narrative is that the slogan "defund the police" was counterproductive because it caused more division than it produced understanding. But I wonder sometimes if it's not like other slogans that have been divisive that got a lot of attention for being divisive, but they actually, in a way that was difficult to see at the time, moved the conversation forward. And I wonder, in your opinion, as the division experts, what do you think about that slogan?
Go ahead, Brian.
I can start it off. I think, I've been involved in social change on the ground for 47 years. I am 67, just turned 67. And I think that change usually happens with a variety of different interacting forces. So the prophets and the organizers are both necessary. The people who speak in divisive ways and the people who speak in reconciling ways each have their role to play in advancing justice. And unfortunately, so I happen to know that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. strategized together behind the scenes, even though they didn't agree at all, but they both knew that the other one was important. So that would be where I would start that conversation. I'm not a prophet. I am an organizer. I'm a mom I'm sort of a mom in the universe. I wear a little thing that says madrina that my friends gave me. So I tend to be on the reconciling side of anything. But it doesn't mean that I don't think it's useful to have people being radical, outrageous prophets.
I think that's so well said. I was involved with the Occupy movement for a short period of time, and many people talked about how it was such a failure. But what looked like a failure, it got the term, the 1%, into the American vocabulary, and in a phenomenal, like if that's a failure, my gosh, it was a pretty effective failure. And part of our problem is that when people make decisions that things are a failure or not a failure, or they say it's divisive or whatever, they're acting as if problems that have been growing and existed for centuries and thousands of years and are perpetual human problems didn't get solved by this one program and this one action. And so I really love your question because it helps us complexify our theory of change. And every good thing that happens, there are probably some negative side effects, unintended consequences. And things that look like a blazing disaster may end up having some positive outcomes too. So I think your question brings that to the surface and helps us maybe all be a little more sophisticated and discriminating when we think about things like this. You know, whatever you think of the slogan, defund the police, it raised the consciousness in people's minds that everything that exists because it's funded. And so maybe there, you know, who knows where that will lead, but all of these are parts of what brings about change one way or another. Yeah.
Very cool. So we need to wrap up, but I wanted to let you know I've got some little cards up here with QR codes. It'll take you to the How to Heal Our Divides website if you want to find more. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to Brian, Alexia, and Tambry for participating in this yet again. Thanks so much.
And thanks to you, Bill.